Human resources are everything because it's your most valuable resource. And certainly I've dedicated my career to helping organizations to get the best from their workforce and create environments where people can thrive and be happy and do great work. So yeah, I guess the human resource is the most precious resource. As human beings, we all have multiple facets to who we are and our personality. We all have the parts to our personality and our behavior that can be problematic, and sometimes it's unhelpful thinking patterns, or it can be, stuff that we've got going on. And if we don't have the skills and the awareness and the motivation to manage those parts of ourselves, it can show up in the workplace as toxic behavior.
Managing a global team is complex, but Deal makes it simpler with payroll, HR, IT and compliance all in one place. That's why over 35,000 businesses trust Deal to hire, pay and manage teams worldwide. See how Deal works at DEEL.com/NICKDAY. That's deal.com/nickday. Deal, your forever people platform. Hello and welcome back to the HR L&D Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Day, CEO at JGA Recruitment Group, and we are specialist human resources recruiters operating worldwide. And if you're joining me today, welcome. Thank you for being here. Please do remember to press that subscribe button or that follow button or wherever you get your favorite podcast content or YouTube content, and follow us along as you go. But please also remember to share this episode with your colleagues and friends so we can really raise the profile of people management and human resources worldwide. Now, today we're going to be uncovering the psychology behind toxic workplaces. We're going to be exploring innovative DE&I solutions, and we're going to be discussing whether the playground bullies really make the best business leaders. If you're ready to rethink how you lead, then this is the episode for you. So do stay tuned, because today we are joined by Dr Mary-Clare Race. She is a globally recognized academic, business leader, and expert in workplace psychology. Formerly president of Mind Gym and now managing Talking Talent's global business, Mary-Clare has spent 2 decades working across 4 continents, advising major organizations like Barclays, GSK, Unilever, and even government bodies like the UK Cabinet Office and the NHS. And her insights have been published in top-tier journals and publications, including Frontiers in Psychology and the Harvard Business Review. So today I'm going to be exploring with Mary-Clare diving into her expertise really on everything from addressing workplace toxicity to overcoming DE&I challenges, and how we can really lead multi-generational workforces as we continue to evolve into this new place of work. So without further ado, welcome Mary-Clare Race to the HR L&D Podcast. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good, Nick. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
No, you're very welcome. I've been excited about having this conversation. I know we've tried to get together a couple of times, so really excited and really delighted to have you here with me today. So first question I ask all of my guests, which is this: what do the words human resources mean to you?
Great first question. For me, I think it's, and for businesses, I think human resources are everything because it's your most valuable resource. And certainly I've dedicated my career to helping organizations to get the best from their workforce and create environments where people can thrive and be happy and do great work. So yeah, I guess the human resource is the most precious resource, is what I would say to that question.
Fantastic. And we're going to be talking about resources because we're talking about it in the context of toxic workplaces today. Obviously, as my introduction mentioned, you've studied psychology. So from your perspective, what do you think are the key drivers of toxicity? Just to give the listeners a bit of a foundation to the conversation today.
Yeah, I think so. As human beings, we all have multiple facets to who we are and our personality. We all have the parts to our personality and our behavior that can be problematic. And sometimes it's unhelpful thinking patterns, or it can be, stuff that we've got going on. And if we don't have the skills and the awareness and the motivation to manage those parts of ourselves, it can show up in the workplace as toxic behavior. So, there's a lot written and researched and said about like psychopaths at work and some of the more problematic at the very far end of the scale. And I think obviously it's important to understand some of that. But I think in the mainstream, like we can see toxic behavior show up in all sorts of ways. And we can all be guilty of toxic behavior sometimes. So for me, it's often about not necessarily understanding what triggers that behavior, how to relate well to each other at work. I think even in today's modern society where we know so much more about psychology and human behavior, we still don't equip people at work necessarily to be able to have strong, robust relationships and have inclusive, fair, healthy environments where toxic behavior isn't likely to occur. So that for me is at the heart of it, is how do you build understanding around that and also strategies around how to manage it.
So let's build on that strategy piece then, because certainly, and we've got a lot of people listening to this all over the world who are working in HR and beyond. And yet nearly everyone I speak to can probably feel like they know someone in their organization, particularly the larger organizations, who they feel probably brings a bit of toxicity into the workplace. And it can be really difficult to address it, to manage it. So any guidance you would have on HR leaders who perhaps recognize there is some workplace toxicity going on, but don't really know where to start?
Yeah, I think, the first point, or the starting point for me, is really examining the environment and the system and the culture of the organization. So when I was studying for my PhD and looking at toxic behavior in the workplace, there typically needed to be three things in place for it to become problematic. So you'd have the toxic individual themselves, but then you need it to also have an environment that was conducive to that kind of behavior. And the sad reality is a lot of the time there are environments that are conducive to toxic behavior, or indeed reinforce and reward toxic behavior. So that's often the starting point, is looking at, what is around this individual that's maybe enabling them to behave this way. And then the third part of that toxic triangle is the term that's well used, is around susceptible followers. So do you have a workforce where there's maybe a lack of psychological safety? People are afraid to speak up. People are afraid to challenge. There's maybe a hierarchy in place where they don't feel they can challenge a more senior individual. So as a HR leader, I'd be wanting to look at, first of all, what is this environment like, this culture? Are we inadvertently rewarding this kind of behavior? And then how have we enabled the rest of the workforce to be able to call out such behavior versus having to quietly accept it and think that there's nothing they can do about it?
Sure. I'm a parent, so I know that if you don't necessarily act on some misbehavior, should we say, or poor behavior, then sometimes it can encourage more of the same. There's an old, this might be well outdated now, so for apologies in advance for using it, but there's a saying that says one bad apple can spoil a bunch, right? But if we don't deal with the toxicity, I imagine it can get worse and worse. It's almost like we're condoning the behavior. So I'd be really interested to know some of the intelligent solutions you've seen organizations perhaps implement to help transform those toxic cultures into the complete opposite, into real thriving environments.
Yeah. And per my earlier point as well, for, starting with looking at your culture and how people are around them, you also obviously have to address the behavior itself. So actually being able to performance manage that individual. The paradox though sometimes is that it can be the more successful people in the organization who are perhaps exhibiting the most toxic behavior. And that can be a tough call to make for a business to say, right, well, this could be our, maybe it's their rainmaker, the person that brings in all the sales, or the most senior person in the executive team. And you've got to have courage around addressing that. And then in terms of how you turn it around, again, I think this comes down to the maturity of, leadership behavior and some of the leadership solutions. So I think if you have an environment where leaders are held to a certain standard or held to account, and where there's a lot of investment put into their development and around, how to do relationships well, how to be inclusive and fair to everyone and not to play favorites, how to, apply robust decision-making criteria where it's not just, you've got an individual who can just do whatever they want, but they've actually put, they've got good rigor around how they operate as a leader. I think that is critical. So having that mature and more sophisticated approach to leadership development, we typically see more toxic leadership behavior in organizations where they maybe don't have that solid approach to leadership. And then I think there's a lot around the culture itself, the values of the organization. How are you bringing those to life? How are you embedding those so they actually have some meaning for individuals? And again, where they feel confident and able to, to speak out, to call out poor behavior, to give feedback. I think a feedback rich culture is also one that will be fairly proofed against toxic behavior, because if feedback's encouraged and that individual's regularly receiving feedback and being expected to act upon it, then again, there's more chance that they will adjust their behavior and behave accordingly.
I'd love to get your view on something, because I think, from my perspective, I think we're in a bit of a crossroads at the moment. I think economically it's challenging for a lot of organizations globally. We know there's a real war for talent, which is a bit of a cliche, but there's a talent shortage at the minute. There's a lot of challenge within HR functions where suddenly profit, if you like, and productivity has become the number one organizational objective almost. And I've seen a lot of the DE&I kind of initiatives and innovations maybe be slightly pushed to the side recently. There was a time when I was doing these podcasts and it was really right in a public frame of mind that we need to make our environments psychologically safe, inclusive, and these kind of things. And actually, I've even heard the word toxicity associated with the word positive, psychological safety being, and the toxicity around that, where people are using that to justify certain behaviors as well. I'd be really interested to get your view, because when economic times are challenging and you need those top performers to really thrive and deliver, but those top performers, as you mentioned, are sometimes the ones showing those toxic behaviors. How can we get DE&I put back on the agenda? How do we overcome some of the DE&I fatigue that may have happened in the past and some of the roadblocks that are put in front of those high performers when they do bring toxicity with it? Yeah,
goodness, there's about 5 different questions in that.
Yeah, I was thinking out loud there. Apologies. Not the best interviewer's skill. I should give you one question only, but I was thinking out loud.
No, it's all good. I'm just trying to think how to structure my response. So first of all, I would say, yes, in economically challenging times, we do tend to see the rise of toxic behavior. And it was interesting because I did most of my research, my PhD, in the City of London, in and around and just after the financial crash of 2007, 2008. And I think, in those challenging times, you do see more of that because the focus suddenly becomes on results at any cost. And, we've got to get the results. We've got to get the job done. And it's more for less and all of that. And we all know in those situations, often the behaviors that we've learned as leaders can go out the window, and the strategies that we've learned and, the ways in which we know we need to show up when you're pressured, when you're stressed, when you're up against it. That's the first thing to go out the window. Similarly, when it comes to investing in people, if your budgets are being, challenged or cut, often the first thing to go will be some of the talent development solutions. So whether that's developing your leaders, coaching, or indeed, DE&I. So I think my advice to some of my clients is always, you've got to see, even though it's sometimes intangible or the payoff is not immediate, you've got to see the value in continuing to build your leadership muscle and invest in leaders who are going to be able to, because the reality is, the leaders who are developed to be resilient and to build lasting cultures where people want to do their best work, they are going to be the leaders that go the distance, even if the short-term results look a little bit different. And then I think with regards to the piece around DE&I, that's a more complex situation because yes, and I've been working in the DE&I space for over 15 years, and again, it's one of those areas where often in an economically challenging time, budgets get cut. But I think that has also been compounded in the last 2 to 3 years by this growing backlash against DE&I interventions, and the Trump administration has, brought that into sharp focus with some of the executive orders this year. Now, I think when you really examine what some of that is about, and even the detail of the executive orders, it's about avoiding DE&I interventions that discriminate one group against another. And I think we should always be striving to avoid solutions that discriminate one group against another. And I think some of the backlash was maybe born out of a sense that some of the work in the DE&I industry was polarizing certain groups and pushing groups apart. And I think as we move forward, it's really important to see the business benefit of an environment that is diverse, equitable, inclusive, and where people feel they belong. Again, I've been speaking to a lot of our clients and partners about this year, and my advice is to put DE&I firmly in the outcome box, along with business performance and high engagement and low staff turnover and all those other things that you would want to achieve for your organization. diversity, equity, and inclusion should be in that category, and we should be focusing on solutions that deliver all of that. I think maybe where we went wrong as an industry was thinking that you start, D&I's starting point, as opposed to it's a business metric that you should be striving to achieve. I think there's also a piece around how do we focus on solutions that bridge the divide between people. Some of our latest research at Talking Talent is focused around the innate ability and desire that human beings have to connect with one another. I mean, that is hardwired into who we are as a species. But yeah, I think we've lost sight of that. And, that was probably a whole other podcast about why that has happened, and modern living and technology and the part that that's had to play in it. But how do we focus solutions on bridging that and reconnecting people? Because it is something that we find easy and that's very innate to us. But again, have we gone astray somewhere where actually some of the solutions have been disconnecting people as opposed to connecting them?
It's an interesting point. It links to something I was going to ask you anyway, which is the rise of remote working, and whether that you've seen any kind of trends that have gone alongside it, where maybe workplace toxicity has either gone down or gone up in alignment with an increased level of work from home. Because I've heard different examples. For example, people that may be very introvert have found work from home has given them more of a voice. They feel like in Teams and Zooms and those kind of solutions, actually, they find it easier to be more vocal and to have their say, whereas face-to-face, maybe they would feel more introverted in doing so. So I've heard kind of differing stories. Have you seen any kind of analysis that trends along the line of whether it's improving workplace toxicity or whether it's actually making it worse?
I'm going to be really annoying and say one of those, it depends. It does depend. Look, I think if you have a highly toxic individual or someone who's prone to toxic behavior, they're going to be toxic in a virtual environment just the same way they'll be in person. Yeah. It will probably show up a little bit differently. And it may be that in a virtual environment, they don't have some of the same opportunity maybe to get to know people, to build relationships, to build trust. And so maybe some of those toxic behaviors are more likely to come out in a virtual setting, but it could also work the other way. And to your point, I think sometimes a virtual setting does give perhaps, more introverted members of a team safety to speak up or a more powerful avenue to speak up, whether that's, as you said, through Zoom chats or polled questions or some of those different digital tools that we have. So I think it depends on the organization and the environment. I don't have any stats to hand as to whether it has made it worse or better. My expectation is probably that it's, the rates are similar, because again, in some situations it will be helping, and others it won't.
You mentioned the word trust there in your response. I imagine that's pretty central to improving workplace toxicity, if we can improve trust and the level of trust within organizations as well. I read within your Talking Talent work that you said that, you describe belonging as potentially broken. So I want to find out a little bit more about what you meant by that and what strategic solutions might be out there for either businesses or leaders to help adopt maybe some of your strategies to rebuild that inclusivity, that feeling of belonging, if there are indeed opportunities for them to do so.
Yeah, and again, this sort of points to my comment earlier about, connection. And, I think we're living through a bit of a connection crisis, if that's not too strong a word, in society more broadly. I mean, if you look at a lot of the more traditional avenues by which we used to seek connection, even, 10, 15, 20 years ago, like our local community, or for some people it might have been the church or the local club that they were involved in. And especially outside of cities, a lot of that has become eroded. So people are struggling to find ways to connect. And then I think within the workplace environment, the consequence, and particularly the pandemic, I think exacerbated some of this, but the fact that we are able to work from anywhere a lot of the time, we've got all these digital tools at our disposal, but has that created a situation where people do feel disconnected and where they don't feel that sense of belonging? And again, I think this is where the imperative has to be on leaders to do more and to double down on that sense of building belonging. So really focusing on, how do I create community here? How do I create relationships between people? Tap into that innate ability that we do have to connect, and where, people can start to build that sense of belonging. So I think there's multiple factors at play there that have resulted in that. And I think, again, we've got to take ownership of that as an industry as well, that some of the well-intentioned solutions that we put in place probably helped, push people further apart as opposed to creating greater degrees of belonging.
Yeah, I know that we met a couple of weeks ago and we talked to them and we were talking about the loneliness crisis. And I didn't know that we had a minister for loneliness even here in the UK, but that almost is an epidemic of, there's a real problem with people suffering from loneliness, which kind of links to that connectivity element you were talking about. And I never realized just how widespread and how broad the issue really is, where people can be in crowded spaces but feel incredibly lonely and disconnected from the world. So it's interesting to understand how that's impacting on broader issues like belonging and like inclusivity.
Yeah, and even like, I read this really interesting report recently about how some of the skills that are now we're staring into this kind of skills shortage around how to connect with one another and how to, because so much of our interaction now is done through a digital platform, that we struggle to, talk to the person beside us in the grocery store or, strike up a conversation at a bar, where, we've all heard these stories even about like in the dating world now where people are, they don't know how to interact if they bump into someone in a bar as opposed to, interacting with them on an app. And again, I think this plays into the workforce when it comes to things like skills, like really fundamental skills like curiosity and openness to ideas and, being open to a different way of thinking. If you live so much of your life through, your device and in an echo chamber that is where an algorithm is constantly reinforcing your worldview and your perspective, it becomes really difficult then when you go into a workplace and you're confronted maybe with someone who thinks and looks and acts very differently to you. You just don't have the skills. And I think we see this particularly in some of the younger generations, like they, don't have those same skills to be able to bridge some of that difference.
Yeah, well, I get it when I exchange messages with my teenage daughter when they're one-word answers, and I write an essay and it's like yes at the end. It's very output-led on the digital format. It's about what's the response I need rather than the small talk which we build up in that face-to-face kind of setting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
A question I wanted to ask, because I read this and I found it really interesting, and something that you put down, which was, do playground bullies make the best business leaders? With a question mark. I wonder if you could just unpack that concept for us and bring it to life for our audience.
Well, that's quite a pivot. This was a piece I was asked to contribute to. It was The Guardian who were reporting on a piece of research that came out last year that showed that these kids that they had tracked from, I think it was, maybe in the 1970s or 80s, and they tracked them through to adulthood. And they saw this trend whereby children who were bullies in the playground went on to have significantly more senior careers and earn more and have, more success, as it were, by those measures of success. My perspective on that was, I challenged that a little bit because I think some of that trend could probably be described by the fact that up until I would say the last 10 years, a lot of the time organizations were rewarding some of those behaviors that, you could akin to, how these bullies were showing up in the playground. So, overly confident, overly assertive, maybe, being aggressive with people, risk taking, all of that kind of thing. And I think we did see then a sea change in the mid 2010s. And I think the Me Too crisis and events in Hollywood really shaked. I was working in America at the time, and it really did shake corporate America to its core in terms of examining, are we rewarding behavior that is bullying, that is toxic? And I think we're now starting to see a big shift in that, which is encouraging. Now, like I said, it's been a little bit alarming in recent years to see just some of the toxic behavior come to the fore again, and certainly amongst some of the public organizations, which I'll probably shouldn't name. But again, so I would say, do workplace bullies go on to greater sex? They may have done, but I think that is really changing. And I think, if that study was to be repeated again in 30 or 40 years' time, I think we'd see a very different result.
HR leaders. I'm Nick Day, host of this podcast, but also founder of JGA Recruitment Group. And here's what I hear every week from top HR leaders. They say, Nick, we can't find the talent. It's our biggest challenge. And when we do, we can't retain them. Well, that's where we come in. At JGA, we specialize in HR recruitment and only HR recruitment. From executive search assignments placing CHROs to contingency hires finding HR pros to global HR transformational contract placements and every people role in between. Across every vertical and at every single level, we know where the top people are, what motivates them, and most importantly, how to get them excited about your opportunity, even if they're not actively looking. With engagement rates over 90%, we don't rely on job boards. We rely on relationships. We place fast, we place right, and we do it in a way that reflects your brand, your values, and your goals. So if you're building a strategic HR function, please don't leave it to chance. Visit jjarecruitment.com or reach out to me directly and let's build the future of work together. Question I'm interested to ask has just come to me now, so I'll try and frame this the best way I can. But obviously I'm speaking to a psychologist here, so I'm intrigued to get your view from your studies. Do you think that when it comes to those playground bullies potentially becoming leaders later, or even playground bullies potentially adding to workplace toxicity, do you think some of this comes as well from perhaps individuals that were bullied in the playground? Those anxieties start early, which then you bring that into the workplace, which makes you less likely maybe to be confrontational, less likely to act when you see it, be maybe they're more anxious, more nervous, don't like that kind of conflict. So therefore it allows that toxicity to continue without it being challenged. Do you see some of those traits coming from the playground, so to speak, into the workplace, which is then adding it to the toxicity in a slightly different way?
Yeah, definitely. And I think if you've grown up in an environment where, whether at home or at school, where you've been subjected to, bullying or toxic behavior, and you've not had the opportunity to develop skills to counter that, or you've not had the support to counter that, then that is of course going to form a pattern there whereby you think, okay, well, the survival strategy here is just to keep my head down, not challenge. These are just the kinds of people that I'm going to have to deal with. The reality is a lot of our behavior as adults, and this is without, going too deep into human psychology, but a lot of our behavior as adults can be traced back to, to childhood and when our personality forms, and particularly those early life experiences in the first, certainly in the first 5 years, and the behavior that we see around us and the patterns and what gets rewarded and what gets reinforced. So I fully expect that would play forward if you'd been subjected to that. Now, that being said, I think, I often get asked about what sets a great leader apart and what are some of the things that shapes a great leader. And there is a quite a significant body of research to show that leaders who overcome some form of childhood adversity are often those that will go on to be able to be successful in the long term and have the resources and the skills and certainly the behaviors to be able to run successful organizations and create great followership around them. So, if you have been bullied as a child, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be on this path to where, you're never going to be one to speak up, you're never going to be one to challenge, and you're always going to be bullied. I think there's absolutely opportunity to overcome some of that and, carve a different path for yourself.
That would make sense to me. I mean, the most common answer I've had on this show to asking people like yourself, what are the qualities that you think, really make for a great leader? And the most common quality we come back is empathy. But often we form empathy and compassion, I'd imagine, from going through some of that trauma to understand what it feels like to be on the other side of something traumatic or something difficult, which allows you to build that compassion, empathy. And I think it's overwhelmingly the most popular response we get is work with an empathetic leader. And I think that kind of moves us away from that old command and control environment that we used to be in, where perhaps that wasn't as respected as such a quality then that it would be now. But have you seen a similar shift in the work and research that you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think empathy for me, I also think resilience and our ability to, thrive through challenging times, that is something that, sets leaders apart. And not just in terms of being able to bounce back, but actually to thrive through challenge. And again, if you've had to overcome something difficult in your childhood, then you'll have had a really good kind of grounding in that. And then the third piece for me as well is about self-awareness. And even when folks are always interested in my PhD because I was studying personality disorder and toxic leaders and all of that. And, and I often say, like, the difference between whether your personality, and particularly if you've got problematic aspects of your personality, the difference between whether that's going to derail you as a leader or not is the degree to which you're self-aware and to which you're able to see, okay, this is how I show up when I'm stressed, or this is how I show up, when the chips are down, and I need to put strategies in place to be able to manage those aspects of myself. I think if you've got that, then it will totally counter any potentially toxic parts to your behavior and your personality. So yeah, and I think when you put all three of those together, like I said, the empathy or the emotional intelligence, having skills around resilience, and particularly during, and this is, when you think about the economically challenging times that we're living through, if you've got a healthy degree of resilience and you know how to manage your resilience, you will be able to push through that in a way where you still show up in a good way for other people, and that you don't resort to bullying tactics or, some of those other toxic behaviors. So yeah, that resilience piece. And then, as I said, the self-awareness and the ability to look in the mirror and really, see how you might be showing up and how you might need to adjust.
There's an interesting challenge. We've kind of touched upon it earlier when we talked about the fact that economically it's challenging, we've got the war for talent. Time is restricted for a lot of individual leaders who want to do the best thing, but feel like they haven't got the time always to do it. So we end up coming away from a coaching culture of asking and empowering our workforce, how would you solve that problem, instead of we go back to that kind of do it this way because I haven't got the time for you to find out your own solution kind of element. We've also got, we talked a little bit about the power of coaching. I'm biased here, so full transparency. I work as an executive coach. I have a huge believer in the power of coaching and taking the time out to reflect and lift your head up rather than leave it lift down. But of course, all of these things have a time commitment to it. So how do we measure, or how do we manage, rather is a better way of putting it, how do we manage that commitment to investing in ourselves, to have that self-reflective work, to become better leaders, to improve our workplace dynamics, when we've got these constant time restraints, particularly when you work in HR where your plate's spinning so many different things at the same time? What would be your advice?
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think in those moments, it is often so much easier to say, do it this way. Here's what, this is just follow this recipe. My advice to leaders is always to look for, don't think of it as this big process that you need to go through, but what are the little small micro coaching moments that present themselves in every situation, in every meeting, whether that's, asking the person to stay on if it's a virtual environment, stay on for 2 minutes at the end of a Zoom call to share an observation of how they showed up and what you liked, and a moment of observation for them, or to ask them to reflect on how they think it went. I mean, that can take 2 minutes. It could be when you're walking to a meeting, how do you use that time to spend 5 minutes talking to someone? So again, looking for those little micro moments to build coaching into your everyday. And again, where it starts to become a habit and it starts to become part of the language that you use. I think that is always my advice, rather than thinking it as it's this thing that I need to make a lot of space for in my day, and I just don't have the time because I'm so busy.
Sure, no, that's great advice. Now, I wanted to try to pivot again into sort of multi-generational workforces and also future trends. And we are dealing now in a world where there's lots of multi-generational workforces. It's more common than ever. And I would say as a result, it can be really hard for experienced leaders sometimes to create environments where generations can really collaborate and thrive. So I'd love to know if you've got any kind of advice from the work and research you've done to help those leaders that may be struggling with some of those challenges. Then after that, I might come back to the world popular word of AI and see how you think that's going to affect the future. But let's start with the multi-generational workforces.
Yeah, so this is one where, I mean, again, it's, I think depending on where, your school of thought on this, we can argue that there's huge differences between the generations, and then there's also a body of thought that says that the generations are actually not all that different. I think that it's important that we're focusing on, again, back to this piece about human connection and the need to connect. Like, what are the mechanisms or the processes or the kind of cultural practices that you can put in place that focus on what unites people rather than what divides them. I think it's focusing on what are some of those fundamental, like, superpower behaviors that will really help everyone to get along better. So, I've already talked about curiosity and empathy, but if you're at one end of the generation spectrum to someone else, if there's a curiosity there around, well, how do you see this situation or how you're approaching it? And that's got to go both ways. I think, oftentimes there's an assumption that it's older workers who have to be more curious about the younger generation and how they see the world. And I think it's really important that the younger generation also see that, that there's older generations that in the workplace with them who came of age and learned skills and learned how to be at work in a very different time. So how do you encourage that mutual curiosity and that empathy for one another? And then also the piece around so I talk about what mechanisms can you put in place. We're a big fan of reverse mentoring or mentoring, where you are helping people from different generations just to get along together, learn from each other, be a sounding board to each other. I think that can be one of the most powerful ways of impacting that. And then again, I think it's, is there an education piece? Is there more to do just around awareness building that gives people that broader perspective and that broader understanding?
It's interesting because when I started work 23 years ago, I remember being almost afraid to leave the office before my MD had. And I work in a sales environment. I started in recruitment, obviously still in recruitment now. And I always thought it'd be frowned upon if I left before my MD did. And he would often work very, very late. And then I'd be sat there working to show I was doing the right thing. And I think I wouldn't necessarily call that, you may disagree, a toxic behavior, but I would say it's an unhealthy behavior sometimes for the leaders to be doing those extra hours, even if it's for the good of the company, because you sometimes forget the influence it can have on those that report in. People like myself who felt it would have been inappropriate to leave early. He may have welcomed it, he may not have done, but the idea from a perception from my side was, if he hasn't left, I can't either. And of course, now I'm a parent, I realized that I wouldn't have been able to make that commitment now. I've got to approach work differently as a caregiver or as a working parent. So how can organizations help overcome, because I think that's kind of a multi-generational shift potentially as well. I think it's maybe an old school way of managing, but it'd be great to understand if you've come across that kind of challenge, if there's any kind of advice you can give to help organizations better support those kind of parents and caregivers and others.
Oh, definitely. I mean, again, I could talk for a long time about this. Yeah. And again, we see some of the, older generations where you were maybe raised in that sort of like hustle culture where it was, you couldn't leave before I remember back in my consulting days where it was like, you couldn't leave before the client. So sometimes you'd be sat in the client office until like midnight because the client was still there. And, and they maybe were operating in some kind of strange basis that they couldn't leave before the consulting team left or whatever. And I think now that has really shifted. And I think that's really healthy that we've moved away from some of those practices that we know led to burnout and ultimately didn't, lead to peak performance for people. I often think for leaders, there's an opportunity or a responsibility to think about the impact that you're having or the impact that your behaviors or the shadow that you cast. It's often something that comes up in my coaching with individuals is, I work on a Sunday and my team get annoyed when I send emails, but why shouldn't I be working on a Sunday? And, there's an easy fix there. We've got the technological tools. Like clear your inbox on a Sunday if that's a practice that you've built over the years and it helps you to be effective, but put a delay on the emails so that your team don't receive them until Monday morning. And again, then you don't have a younger worker, or even it doesn't necessarily need to be a younger worker, but a worker who operates to a different schedule to you getting stressed out on a Sunday because they've just had 3 emails from the boss. And again, I think we've got so much more effective at supporting people through some of those big life transitions. So whether it's, being a parent or having perhaps older relatives to look after, or also, there can be all sorts of situations that mean people have things going on outside of life that can sometimes compete with what is happening at work. And I think smart organizations recognize that supporting people through those situations and not putting expectations on them that they can't meet is the really healthy way to do it. So flexible, whether it's flexible working patterns or, being open to their ideas about how they need to do their work, I think is a no-brainer to me.
Super. Now I'm going to ask a question about AI. I also want to ask you a question in a moment, just tell us a little bit more about what Talking Talent do. So you may be able to combine the two or we can keep them separate. But I'm really interested in how you see AI shaping sort of workplace culture in the future, particularly in relation to psychology and leadership. So from my perspective, and this is just my own personal view, and take it or leave it as you like if you're listening to this, I've got a separate podcast called Mindful Past where I talk about a whole episode on this, which is I'm a huge fan of AI in enabling the workforce, augmenting the workforce, be able to do more with less, have more time with your families, because AI can support you in different ways. But I'm very nervous about the idea of AI, maybe as a coach, replacing that talking element, that idea that AI can give the responses to something that's so complex as the human brain. So I would love to hear, of course, about what Talking Talent do as a service, but I would love to just tap into your thoughts on how you see AI shaping workplace culture, particularly from a psychology perspective, because I'm a little bit nervous about that element about it. And there are already solutions out there that say you don't need the coach, you don't need that talking piece. The AI can give you the responses, have that kind of persona, if you like, that's dedicated to you. But maybe I don't understand it enough. I don't know. But full disclosure, I'm very nervous about that element of AI.
Yeah, and look, I think I share your views there, Nick. I mean, the key word for me is augment. I think that AI can be a really powerful tool in augmenting a human-centered, whether it's a coaching process or a leadership development pathway. I think the risk is that we think it can replace it entirely, and that's where I would share your nervousness. Now, I think AI continues to get smarter, and I mean, I play around with it all the time, asking it for, just to see. And oftentimes the response you get back is very sophisticated, and it builds in nuance, and it talks about, well, you might want to think about this, you might want to think about that. But yes, there's no substitute for having that in person, particularly when it comes to something like coaching. Now, Talking Talent, we are a coaching and leadership development business, and our remit is around helping organizations to get the most out of all of their talent. So all of their talent being like every part of their business, and not just the talent pools that we typically think of. And we have a digital platform that supports our learning journeys and our coaching journeys. And again, it's been built. We actually built it in partnership with the Center for Ethical Design in California quite a few years ago now. And our intention there was like, how do we build a digital experience? And we're increasingly integrating more and more AI into that. But how do we build a digital experience that supports and augments what a human coach can provide, and perhaps gives you information and data in a just-in-time fashion? So maybe just before you're going in for that important meeting with your manager where you want to show up in a more effective way, or if you've got to give some difficult feedback to someone. But again, our belief is that it's got to be in partnership with a human-centered approach, with a real person supporting you and helping you in your development journey. I mean, I shared this actually I was speaking at a conference recently, and I shared a story of a good friend who'd sent me a message saying that she decided to get divorced. And, so I quickly called her, and it was, ChatGPT. She told ChatGPT about this situation with her husband, and ChatGPT had concluded that they should probably get divorced. So quickly put the skids on that for her. And I said, do you think maybe you need to, you and your husband need to see a therapist or a counselor? So luckily I diverted that one. But again, that's an example of where without the right guidance or structure around it, it could go awry very quickly.
Of course, it wants to give you the response it thinks you want to hear, and I think that's the danger. If not of right state of mind potentially, then you create your own echo chamber. It wants to give you the right response to what you want to hear, and of course, that's not what a coach will do. A coach isn't there to be your friend. A coach is there to challenge your thinking and to explore different avenues. So I think that's probably where the big fundamental shift is at the moment, anyway, in the way that I see it. But really interesting, and some great work that Talking Talent do. There will be a link, of course, in the show notes for those that want to find out more. So please do click through. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you'd like to bring to the audience's attention regarding either the work that you do, regarding workplace toxicity, about how to handle particular challenges, or are you ready to open the HR L&D vault?
No, I think we've covered so many topics, Nick. I don't know that we could have possibly covered any more. So all good with me.
Great, fantastic. Well, let's open the vault then. These are 3 short, sharp questions for you. And the first is this: what's one piece of advice you would give to HR leaders who are looking to address toxicity within their organization? So one key piece of advice.
I would say have courage and be prepared to, if you're going to address this, you're really going to need to address it. It's not a quick fix, and it's not going to be if you've got and particularly if you've got a toxic culture, you've got to be prepared to dig deep and sort it out and go the distance.
Perfect. If you could implement one major change in how organizations approach leadership and culture, what would it be?
Start training leaders from the day they enter the workforce. It should be a muscle that we are continually building. It should be like nutrition. It's something we're always working towards, as opposed to, you go on a course once a year if you're lucky.
Fantastic. And last but no means least, if you could give your younger self one piece of advice and you were just starting out in this new world of work, what would that advice be?
Oh, goodness. What advice? I think when I started it's 20 years since I graduated from my master's, and I remember thinking that I was going to solve the leadership challenges and the challenges that I saw in the workplace. And here we are 20 years later, and I'm not sure that we're that much further forward. So my advice probably to myself 20 years ago would be this, you're going to do some great work, but, be prepared to go the long haul.
Be patient.
Be
patience and resilience. Well, you say resilience is in there with all the great leaders, right? Empathy and resilience. So maybe a bit of patience in there as well. Dr. Race, thank you ever so much for joining me today. Thanks for sharing all of your incredible insights on workplace psychology, DE&I, and of course, leadership. As you say, we've covered a lot of ground today. I hope it's been really useful for our listeners. Thank you ever so much for joining me today. Of course, for those that want to find out more about Mary-Clare's work, or if you want to connect with her directly, there will be links in the show notes where you can go straight through to Talking Talent or straight through to her LinkedIn profile as well if you want to find out more. Of course, there'll also be a link in there to our work, which is jgarecruitment.com. If you're struggling with a particular recruitment requirement in the world of HR, L&D, or people management, please do give us a call. Otherwise, please do remember to click subscribe. Please do remember to follow us. And thank you once again, Dr. Mary-Clare Race, for joining me today on the HR L&D podcast.
Thank you, Nick. Talk soon.
Global teams are more connected than ever, but managing payroll, HR, and IT can still feel fragmented. Deal simplifies global work with one platform that keeps everything running smoothly. No compliance guesswork, no third-party payroll, just seamless operations backed by 24/7 expert support. That's why over 35,000 companies trust Deal to handle their global workforce. Visit deal.com/nickday to see how Deal can help. That's DEEL.com/NICKDAY. Deal, your forever people platform.